At the age of 52, Anne Fisher experienced the profound loss of her mother, Fiona. Their bond had been exceptionally strong, and Fiona's passing left Anne utterly shattered. Despite being a mother and wife herself, nothing could fill the void that Fiona's absence created in her life. A week after Fiona's passing, the retirement home in which she lived called Anne and asked her to pick up her mother's personal effects. What no one expected, even Anne, was that she wouldn't be coming home alone. When Anne walked into the retirement home, memories of her mother flooded back and she had to stifle a sob. She headed for the reception desk and asked about her mother's belongings. "Mrs. Fisher," the receptionist said sympathetically, "if you like, we can load the boxes with your mother's clothing and effects into your car." The receptionist was interrupted by a cry. "Annie Carson," a voice asked. "Is that you?" Anne turned and saw a frail-looking elderly woman standing before her. "Mrs. Gove," she gasped. "Oh my God. It's been over 30 years. Mrs. Gove limped over and placed her arms around Anne. "Oh, Anne," she whispered, "seeing you is almost like being with my Simon again." Anne hugged Mrs. Gove and tears flooded her eyes. Simon. How long had it been since she'd last thought about Simon? Years, probably since Mandy was born, and she finally made peace with her past. But once, when she'd been the happy, lively Annie Carson, she'd been in love, madly, completely in love with Simon Gove. They'd met in college at a campus bar. Anne had been sitting with her roommate when she'd suddenly been doused in ice-cold beer. She jumped to her feet with an angry cry, only to find herself face to face with the most beautiful boy she ever seen. "I'm so sorry," the boy cried. Please forgive me." Anne had opened her mouth to remonstrate, but the boy dropped to his knees in front of her. "You're so beautiful," he said. "And this was the only way I could think of to get your attention, to get you to notice I'm alive. Please forgive me and say you'll marry me." Anne had burst out laughing, and May, her roommate, exclaimed, "Annie, this guy deserves an A+ for effort. Marry him already." It had been a wonderful night, and when later that night Simon had kissed her at the door of her dorm building, she knew he was the one, that she would never, ever want to kiss anyone else. Anne and Simon had been inseparable from that night on, and when he proposed for real 2 years later, she accepted. He took her home to meet his parents, and they were very welcoming. "You are the first girl Simon has ever brought home," Mrs. Gove had exclaimed, "and you're the prettiest thing I've ever seen." He was right about that. Anne laughed. "You can't trust Simon, you know," she exclaimed. "He's a fibber." Mrs. Gove took Annie's hand in hers. "No, my dear," she said. "My Simon adores you, and I think he's found the right girl." By the end of the visit, Mrs. Gove and Anne had been best friends, and when Simon met Anne's mother, Mrs. Carson had been delighted with her daughter's fiancé. Anne had believed then that she was living a fairy tale, that everything was perfect. She was 23, she was about to become a teacher and marry the man of her dreams. Then 2 days before the wedding, Anne and her mother went to pick up the dress, and when they got home, they found Simon's father sitting on their doorstep, his head between his hands. "Mr. Gove," Anne had cried, "what are you doing here so early?" Mr. Gove dropped his hands and struggled to his feet, and when she saw his ravaged face, Anne knew something terrible was about to happen. "Annie," he whispered, "Annie, it's our Simon. There was a car accident last night, and he and his friend David begged." A horrible sound, half scream, half sob, choked Mr. Gove. "No," Annie screamed. She stepped forward and pushed Mr. Gove. "Liar, liar." Anne ran into the house, up the stairs, and locked herself in her room. She lay on her bed and let her fear wash over her. "Liar," she whispered. "He's a liar. My Simon is all right. He's all right." A little later, she heard someone knocking on the door. "Annie," she heard Mrs. Gove's voice say, "Please let me in." Anne heard the pain in Simon's mother's voice. She couldn't say no to her, not when the pain she heard echoed her own so exactly. So she got up and opened the door. "My love," Mrs. Gove said, "our Simon is gone." The two women held each other and wept until there were no tears left. "Simon will always live on in our hearts," Mrs. Gove had said to Anne after the funeral. "You're very young, Anne," she said. "One of these days you will wake up and you will discover it's a beautiful day despite the pain. And maybe on another day you may meet a young man and you will discover that you can love someone else. And that's okay. That's life. It doesn't mean that you love Simon any less. It just means that you are human and that you are healing." Anne listened with tears running down her cheeks, shaking her head in denial. "No," she cried. "Yes," Mrs. Gove said gently, "because that is what Simon would have wanted. He loved you so much, Annie, he would have done anything for you. So do this for him. Be happy." Now, nearly 30 years later, Anne was standing with Mrs. Gove. "Why are you here?" Anne asked. "Mr. Gove?" Mrs. Gove sighed. "I'm afraid Alfred passed away 6 months ago," she explained. He had Alzheimer's, and so I sold the house and we moved here. We were in the married couple's wing. They've just moved me here. My mother was here, Anne explained. She just passed away. I miss her so much. Mrs. Gove gave Anne another hug. You must be strong, my dear. Do you have family? Anne nodded. Yes, I do, she confirmed. My daughter is grown up. She's left the house. My husband, well, he spends a lot of time working and he golfs on the weekends. Mrs. Gove said softly, I guess being a woman means being alone mostly. Anne looked at Mrs. Gove and an idea blossomed. Maybe, maybe not. When Anne arrived home that afternoon, she was not alone. Hey, honey, she called to her husband. Jack? Her husband came out smiling. Hey, hun, he said, then he stopped dead. Who's that? He asked, looking at Mrs. Gove, who was standing in the lounge with her suitcase beside her. Jack, Anne said. This is Mrs. Gove, a very dear, very old friend. She's moving in with us. What? Asked Jack. What are you talking about? Well, Anne said, you've always said my mother was welcome to live with us. But she didn't, Jack protested. Because she, Anne stopped and searched for words that wouldn't hurt. Because she didn't like me, Jack cried. You think I didn't know that? Why do you think I suggested she move in? I knew she never would. Anne stared at Jack. It was a scheme to make yourself look good, she asked. You didn't mean it? Well, that's too bad. Because Mrs. Gove is moving into the suite I fixed for my mother. That woman moves in, and I move out, Jack shouted. Go ahead, Anne said calmly. You already spent all your time at the office or at the golf course. I honestly don't think it will have an impact on my life if you leave. Besides, you forget, this is my house. I bought this house before I met you. I have a job and a good salary. I don't need you, Jack. I haven't needed you in years, not since you stopped loving me. That night, Jack slept on the couch and Mrs. Gove slept in the guest suite. In the morning, he packed his bags and left the house. Anne called her daughter Mandy on Skype and explained everything. Mom, Mandy said, I'm not surprised you kicked Dad out, but I am surprised you took in some random old woman. Mandy, Mrs. Gove is not some random old woman. Anne cried. She is the mother of the love of my life, the boy I was going to marry when I was 23. She's so alone and I love her. I miss Gran so much and I think Mrs. Gove and I will be good for each other. I want you to meet her, okay? I think you will love her. You're going to marry someone else? Asked Mandy. Tell me about him. So Anne did, and it felt good to talk about Simon and those wonderful dizzy years when she was Annie and had believed that dreams could come true and that love was forever. When Mandy came to visit for Thanksgiving, she fell in love with Mrs. Gove and the two giggled and gossiped like schoolgirls. Anne smiled the whole weekend. She had never felt so good about her life, so relaxed. Then the phone rang and it was Jack. He asked to speak to Mandy and Anne could hear him whine. Did you know your mother left me for an old woman? Mandy answered coldly, you were the one who left Dad. In fact, you left Mom years ago when you stopped paying attention to her, being there for her. I've met Mrs. Gove and she's a lovely, gentle lady. I'm glad she's here with Mom. Anne was delighted to have Mrs. Gove with her. The two women spent 2 wonderful years together until Mrs. Gove's already fragile health deteriorated. Towards the end, she was hospitalized, but Anne was there, holding her hand during her last moments and saw her friend smile and whisper her son's name before her eyes closed for the last time. Mrs. Gove was laid to rest beside her husband and her beloved son. After the funeral, Anne was stunned when Mrs. Gove's lawyer contacted her and asked her to come into his office. He conveyed that Mrs. Gove had bequeathed her entire estate to Anne, totaling over $1.7 million. Reading from the will, he quoted, Anne Carson Fisher was meant to be my daughter, but destiny intervened. At the twilight of my life, Anne became my true daughter by her unwavering presence. Anne was astounded by Mrs. Gove's generous gesture, yet her astonishment deepened when her ex-husband reached out to her. Anne, he uttered in a slick tone. Darling, I was thinking we could give it another shot, start afresh. Jack, Anne retorted sharply. I'd sooner see you in the depths of hell. Leave me alone. You're no longer a part of my life.